Hello, I'm Farhana Sheikh and welcome to It's About Youth, the show that explores what matters to youth ahead of GE15. On today's episode, we will be tackling a key issue voters would be on the lookout for, be it past election, this election, or even future elections, which is corruption. Here with us today is Muhammad Faisal Abdul Aziz from the Muslim Youth Movement of Malaysia, or ABIM. An organisation that has been vocal in advocating for good governance and integrity since they were founded in the 1970s, alongside Tharma Pillai, co-founder of Undi18, the youth movement that has successfully advocated for the voting age to be lowered from 21 to 18. Thank you so much for joining us today. Now, diving straight into it. Malaysia was ranked the 62nd place out of 180 with a score of 48 over 100 in the latest Corruption Perception Index. Now, this number may not mean as much to some, but for many, with the string of corruption and abuse of power the country has faced, especially among top leadership, there's plenty to worry about, and these concerns are valid for youth who will be taking over the country one day. So we would like to get your opinion both on this huge issue that will be still a key issue in the upcoming election, GE15. So first and foremost, if we can gauge the current scene on this topic, Faisal, what is your perception on youth, their take on corruption and integrity issue? Are they more aware as compared to before about the corruption issues that are plaguing the country right now?
Okay, first of all, thank you, AWANI, for having me in this very important topic on corruption. And perhaps It's About Youth will be a best platform for the youth to express their opinion in conjunction with general election. Okay, referring back to your question on are we well aware about the corruption issues in Malaysia? I myself, I'm pretty sure, I'm confident that especially youth, we are well aware about the corruption issues. In fact, with the growth of alternative media compared to mainstream media dominance in 1980s, 1990s. It shed some lights for the youth to know more, especially perhaps in depth or in detail about the corruption scandals in Malaysia. And in fact, if we have discussion among the youth about corruption, we as a youth, we perceive corruption not equally similar to any other criminal cases, ordinary criminal cases. I mean, in terms of how to curb this matter. Just like due process of law, you detain the offenders, and then you brought to the court, and then you sentence, and that's it. So for the youth especially, and not only youth, I think for all Malaysians, when we talk about corruption, when we have discourses or discussions about corruption, we want to see the way forward, long-term solution, because all of us agree corruption is like a cancer. We need to it need to be treated at root, and we need to prevent it from being spreaded all over the country. So having this idea, as I said, with the growth of alternative media and so on, it shifted the mentality of the Malaysian, especially the youth, when it deals with the corruption issues.
So, Tharma, being involved with a movement that fights for fair and inclusive elections, do you think the youth that you work with, for example, feel the same way? Are they aware of these issues as well?
Definitely. I think I concur with Sarah Faisal that there is a growing awareness that corruption is the #1 enemy in this country, and there must be movements to mitigate it, to fight it, to basically eliminate it from Malaysia. It's one of the structures that basically erodes away at democracy, erodes away at institutions and development in Malaysia. However, I think one of the big issues that we face is that there is a lack of understanding. While the sentiment is strong, but there's a lack of understanding of what is corruption really, right? Because we are strongly against, or at least principally against, certain things like lower level corruption because it's easy to understand. Where you pay a certain bribe, right? Duit kopi, right? We are intuitively, easy to understand. But when it comes to complex cases of corruption, and what I would say, political corruption, right? Because it's complex, it's large, it involves so many stakeholders, and it involves so many levels of development. And I would consider political corruption to be the mother of corruption in Malaysia. I would say that there is still a long way for us to go to be able to explain why these things are fundamentally bad and how do we eradicate this problem in the first place. Because if you look at even issues like the big scandals that we have, SRC, 1MDB, these are not straightforward issues, right? These, these involve a nexus of state corporations together with corrupt politicians and individual actors that all are very complex in terms of the web they've developed, and also the mechanisms that they use in order to take money from the government. It's not straightforward at all. So I think that is the bridge that's the gap that we have to be able to address, right? Between the understanding of what is simple levels of corruption and people are against it versus these larger scales of corruption, and can we understand it, address it, and effectively advocate against it within more complex mechanisms. For example, political financing laws and other initiatives to address these sort of larger, more detrimental versions of corruption.
Okay. Let me add to that complexity now, because you already said, it's a complex issue when it involves so many actors, when it involves, large sum amount of money, and that, people may not understand it in layman terms, right? There are also right now many issues surrounding youth. After recovering from the shocks of pandemic, youth are facing unemployment, basic livelihood issues, unable to get food, job, unable to just survive from day to day. So what is the weight of corruption when compared to all these other issues plaguing youth? Why would corruption matter to them if they can't get food on the table?
So I think for me, I think that's why it's so important to have civil society and parties to talk about this, right? Because I think for a long time, we've never really drawn that immediate link between corruption versus livelihoods, right? And we saw in GE15 how this message can be very effective. There was a very powerful speech by Mat Sabu where he said that, ni approve ni, right? I think that was something that was very approachable to even someone simple, right? Someone average citizen where you're not engaged with politics, you're not engaged with policy, but you understand intuitively, okay, this is how it works. And I think that messaging is so important. Otherwise, there's a lot of people on the ground who feel like, you know what? Let them do what they want, let them be corrupt, as long as they give me what I need, or as long as they sort of give me a little bit of the pie, right? I think that's one of the issues when, and I think many of the public, I think, don't understand that there is a larger pie that's being eaten up, and you could have a piece of that if it was not being taken away due to corruption. I think that's one of the challenges that we have to be able to explain. And I think through organizations, the work that ABIM does, Undi18 does, and also organizations or coalitions like Rasuah Busters, we're hoping to be able to engage the public and push this narrative more actively. But really, it is a work in progress, just because, as I mentioned earlier, right, people are now against, especially when you talk about religion, right? People are fundamentally against simple levels of corruption because they understand it intuitively. But how do we take that next step and make sure people are interested in larger, more complex, multinational scandals? That's a challenge.
Yeah. So, Faisal, making that connection, right, like Tharma said just now, we're talking about, I guess, corruption among leaders of the country here that may have a cascading effect on youth. As mentioned, with many other issues that are plaguing youth right now, affecting youth, do you think corruption in itself have a grave impact on youth, to this section of society, on youth, and should it be concerned, or should it only be a concern for those in the upper level? How do we tie in the connection from upper level to youth at the bottom?
Okay, we need to make people understand, the general public understand that all issues are interrelated. When we talk about corruptions, of course, it has something to do with the quality of life, the employment, issue of public health, security, and so on. Because even we can see the basic analogy, even the strong policies can even be compromised due to corruption. For example, the issue of rampant pollution, for instance. Even if we have a good set of rules, regulations to limit or to ensure that pollution will not be rampant in this country, if there is corruption in the law process, so the pollution still could be rampant in our country, and of course it will affect our livelihood, it will affect our health, it will affect our quality of life. Same goes to employment. Yeah, the average youth will not be given opportunity due to nepotism, favoritism, and so on. And also, what more, if you want to talk about foreign investment, if our country is really explicitly known as a corrupt country among other countries in the world, across the globe, foreign investor will not come. So it will close the door of opportunity for the youth to get employment. So all of these issues have interconnected each other, and we could not say that we should prioritize bread and butter issues over corruption, because all issues are interconnected each other.
I think that's the one thing that we need to address, right? We need to address this gap, this missing part of the connection that probably some youth may not understand, or some leaders may not, may put it as if, make it as complex as they can to make the people down below, not be able to understand it. So, okay, we'll get back to that. Now, drawing on what you said, Faisal, so the interconnectedness of youth and corruption. According to MACC statistics, civil servants in their 40s and below constitute 57.8% of more than 5,000 people arrested for graft between 2007 and August 2022. In 2020 alone, MACC detained about 275 individuals aged between 18 and 30, comprising students from institutions of higher learning and government employees, for their involvement in corrupt acts. There are so many other statistics I can cite, but I'll cite those two for now. Is this worrying to you? Have corruption practices at least, spread among youth, and why so?
Okay, of course, that statistic really worrying, and what worrying us more, as if our country have reached to the level of what was reasserted by Prof. Sheikh Altas, the problem of corruption, where two cancers that will await due to corruption, as a result of corruption, nihilism and also cynicism. Okay, well, let me give a brief about this nihilism and cynicism. The transition to nihilism is when society experiences as if there is no any other moral values that can be our guidance in a society. And even we can see, even if you ask people who condone corruption, maybe they will say, oh, our top leaders also do same things. Our enforcement officers, like whoever run the top level of enforcement officers, also do the same thing. So this about what aboutism reflects as if corruption being the societal norm. That's really worrying us. So if corruptions become something norms in our society, it will bring about the cynicism. Cynicism is the prejudiced attitude towards another person of their success, their wealth, because of this injustice system in our country, because the opportunity in order to get rich or to being promoted, for example, to get tender projects only limited to those who have money. So what was reasserted by Sheikh Alatas, when he emphasized about nihilism and cynicism, it will be a bottleneck to our social cohesion. What more about the integration between a multi-ethnic society in Malaysia?
Okay, we'll talk more about this. We'll go for a break. Stay with us. Welcome back to It's About Youth, where we talk about things that matter to youth ahead of GE15. And today we'll be talking about corruption with Undi18 Co-founder Tharma Pillai and also Faisal from ABIM. So we've talked a little bit about youth awareness of corruption and how do we define corruption. So now, Tharma, let's talk a bit more on solutions. What do you make of the government's effort right now in fighting corruption so far? Do you think we have done enough?
Absolutely not. That's a simple answer, right?
Okay.
For me, I think that the solutions have already been there. I think we've had so much of forums, discussions, and in fact, a national plan, the National Anti-Corruption Plan (NACP), that was already developed to address the idea of corruption in its whole, right? And I think just to share a few ideas, a few key concepts within that plan over here. Number one is that we have to look at, since we mentioned MACC just now, right? Yeah. We have to look at MACC reform, right? Because one of the perceptions, whether it's true or not, right, is that MACC is not persecuting or selectively persecuting on certain cases. holding on certain other cases, right? Whether or not this is true, but having independence of institution is so incredibly important so that we are having that confidence that every case is being evaluated on a fair basis, on a timely basis, not just held over or just held up for a couple of years before it's being started, the investigation. I think that's one thing that's very important in terms of the integrity of our national anti-corruption agency, number one. Number two is that we have an issue where, because prosecution powers, investigation is under MACC, but prosecution is under the AGC's chamber, the Attorney General's chamber. So I think there must be a separation in terms of who's the agency that advises government and who's the agency that prosecutes criminals and prosecutes people that do crime. Because when these are mixed together, then you have issues where there is interference or there is a possibility of interference by the executive or by government into who goes to jail and who gets let off, right? If cases are pulled back and all that stuff. So these are really core issues that need to be solved. But also I think on a cultural level, having certain key leaders who are big guns in the past, having them go to jail and having them found guilty and seeing that there is a price to pay for corruption. I think that sends a very strong signal culturally. We can talk about education all day, right? We can talk about trying to change society, going to schools and all that, which I agree with, by the way. But as long as we don't see the big whales of corruption being charged and put in jail, such as in other countries, until then people will feel emboldened, right? They'll feel that, hey, you know what? I can just do this because the big guys are still okay, right? So I think it's so important as a cultural effect to see these big whales be toppled down. So my suggestion is this, that if we want to address corruption, it must be signifiers by society, but most importantly, you have to look back at institutions. And also what I mentioned earlier, just very quickly, in terms of political financing as the mother of corruption, whereby a lot of corrupt activities are legitimized because we use it in the context of political parties. So there is a dire need for us to regulate it, to control it, to make sure that there is some form of definition that if you do this, it's corruption. You must declare any funds that you receive for your party early on. There must be a public registry. I think these are mechanisms that are already implemented in so many countries. In fact, there are countries that are equally at our level of development that are less than us that are surprised. How is it that a country as advanced as Malaysia, we don't even have a political financing law? I think that's something that's so surprising for many partners that we speak to overseas. I think these are the key reforms that need to be established before we can do anything else.
And yet we are entering another GE15
Correct.
without a political financing law.
Absolutely.
But we have anti-hopping law. So, but, you know, aside from that, you know, we talked about leaders just now, having an impact, you know, seeing corrupt leaders being arrested, seeing corrupt leader being charged, it gives an impact to the people, to youth in general, that, you know, something is being done. So if the big guys can't do it, we can't do it too. So drawing onto that, I would like to get both of your opinions on this. Do you think the leaders of today are leading by example? Faisal, you can go first.
Yeah, if you want me to ask you a question, I think I would like to promote a book written by Prof. Kamal Hassan, Corruption and Hypocrisy Among Leaders and ... Actually, I was intrigued by the title when Prof. Kamal Hassan used the term hypocrisy, or in Malay we use munafik. In Malay tradition or Malay culture, munafik is a very heavy term reflecting a person that cannot be trusted at all. And I do believe Prof. Kamal Hassan, Tan Sri Kamal Hassan, he has his own ground why he used this term of munafik, hypocrisy. Maybe because due to the current political landscape, when we can see there are many politicians just do a lip service. Yeah. They say to the people that they are fighting against corruption, but nothing concrete to be done, especially in structural reform, to reform the country, to ensure that the law cannot be circumvented by corrupt people to do some corruption and so on. And even in fact, by looking at the CPI, by looking at the current structure, still there are a lot of perceptions that they need to do more to prove that they are really honest to fight against corruption. One more thing about the solution, if I may add, we also need to emphasize more on the freedom or the right of information, even the concession, the agreement, even whatever deals by the government. Even now we can see the LCS, literal combatant ship, for example. So all this issue raised it has something to do with the right of information. And of course, when it comes to right of information, we need to deal with the OSC, Official Secret Act, and we need to deal with the Whistleblower Protection Act, because I think if Malaysian, we don't want to bring the case to MCC, we can be whistleblower, but provided
it needs to be able to be protected.
Yes,
whistleblower.
because even Section 6 of Whistleblower Protection Act say that disclosure of any corruption cases need to be in accordance with any written law. So meaning to say, as if OSC will prevail if there is inconsistency.
Yeah. What about you, Tharma? How do you feel about leaders of today?
For me, I think that I definitely agree with Sarah Faisal that I think there's a lot of us who have been saying, or a lot of leaders that have been talking about the language of corruption, that have been saying that, okay, we have to fight corruption, we have to push back about it. There are certain coalitions that are built and being like, oh, okay, we're different just because we're anti-corruption and all that stuff. Yet when you look at the track record of many of these leaders and their ability and their desire to support anti-corruption legislation, it's not there. Right? I think this is the core problem that we have, right? Because it's not just about picking the right people. I think the problem with Malaysian understanding of corruption is that we always assume if we choose the right leadership, therefore corruption is gone, right? That's not reality. You can only fight corruption if the worst, the most greedy, the most selfish people is forced to be a good person, an anti-corrupt person, because of the systems that we're in. That's the only way to change society. Because inevitably, you can talk about corruption all you want out of power, but the reality is that power reveals everything. Power reveals your true self, right? And there are many leaders who were strong advocates outside of government, but when they got into government, they practiced a lot of corrupt practices, right? They did nepotism, cronism, gave preferential contracts. All these kind of things were stuff that they did inevitably, right? So I do think that this is one of the problems that we have at the moment, which is why I think for me it goes back to, if us as society, if we want to judge our leadership, can we go for leaders who are actively pushing for institutional change, systemic change about corruption, not just signal, like virtue signaling about being good people or being good leaders, right? Because goodness is relative, right? If someone might feel, if someone takes corrupt practices, corrupt money, and gives me a little bit of money, that's a good thing, right? So good is arbitrary, good is relative. But structural ideas against corruption, as Sarah Faisal said, freedom of information, whistleblower protection, these are core ideas that we must advocate for, we must champion.
Yeah. So the key question here for both of you, since we are talking about hopefully getting rid of a systemic problem in the country, how do we engage youth to join the fight against corruption? Where do we start and how?
Okay, when we talk about the campaign against corruption, we need to do more. I mean, we need to institutionalize the campaign, the awareness. So, from ABIM perspective, what we did, we consolidate the anti-corruption or the dignified nation as part and parcel, embedded as integral part of Malaysian identity. That's why we bring the idea of Bangsa Malaysia. Bangsa Malaysia means the Malaysian nation with noble values that can be consolidated among all Malaysians to be a dignified nation, to be a dignified society. So we are proud to be Malaysian because we are anti-corruption. So that should be integral part of Malaysian identity, Bangsa Malaysia. So all races need to be jointly and hand in hand to institutionalize this awareness. To ensure that it is part of our identity, well embedded as our identity, that we should proud of as a Malaysian.
And it should be starting from young, right?
Yes.
So this identity should be already embedded for the young people to, from the very start, they know that this is the identity of Malaysia, it's anti-corruption. What about you, Tharma? How do we get youth to get onto the fight with corruption?
For me, I think one very scary statistic that we found out in our engagement with SPRM's education arm was that they shared to us that in their research that up to about 30% of university students that they polled were okay, or at least in favor of certain corrupt practices. And just for context, these were university students, and as we know, corruption is largely a white-collar crime. So it means that even in those situations where there's no pressure, there's no temptation, there is at least 30% that are somewhat okay with it, right? What more if these individuals who are from universities, they go into positions of power, positions of opportunity, positions where they can make use of the contracts and connections that they have, right? So I think it's very important for us to be able to educate from the young, similar to how we've had so much of campaigns and programs anti-dada, for example, right? And many other things. I do think that if we've identified corruption as the #1 enemy in our country, why don't we go more? Why don't we educate more from the schooling age itself, and not just in terms of simplistic concepts, but also to make sure that people understand that there are bigger ideas of corruption, right? Because it's not just about small duit kopi, but it's larger issues in terms of integrity, and in terms of choosing the right leaders. I think that's the core philosophy that we have to engage with. In terms of Undi18, we've been working together with Rasuah Busters to be developing, and before Parliament was dissolved, we managed to develop the all-party parliamentary group for looking into integrity and anti-corruption, right? So I think I really hope that whichever party that's there uses this as a platform, because it's so important that we're not only engaging through parliamentarians, it's so important also that the youth and the public have a platform to feel engaged, that civil society can go and talk to them and say that, hey, what are desires that you want? We can do surveys, we can do public perceptions on this and bring this to Parliament so that proper laws are made. So I think education is one element, but after you educate, where is this idealism and where is that energy being brought to? How are we then going to mobilize these, energized young people towards pushing back against corruption in a more concrete manner? I think that goes hand in hand, right? So I think that engagement process is so important in making sure that this next generation becomes an anti-corruption generation, and we actively push back for the sake of not only the current Malaysia, but also the Malaysia in 50 years, Malaysia of our grandkids, our great-grandkids.
Yeah. I mean, that's definitely the hope that we all have, and it's definitely a structural reform that is not just from the top, bottom, but from all around.
Yeah.
So, okay, that's all the time we have, unfortunately. Thank you, Tharma, and also Faisal, for being with us today. GE15 is coming, so don't forget to exercise your right to vote, because the power is in your hands. Thank you, and goodbye.